Hi. Hello and welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome back Michael Meredith. Michael has been at the school before. Am I supposed to show this? Is this okay? Michael's been at the school before, co-chairing the Material Matters Conference several years back. So I always think of him as an honorary Trojan, so welcome home. I met Michael many years ago when we were both pursuing our graduate studies at Harvard. We fast became friends to the point of him being one of the groomsmen in my wedding. And since I've had the opportunity to collaborate on projects and books and challenge and motivate one another through a kind of bi-coastal dialogue and at times perhaps competition. So, what's unique about Michael's work, which he undertakes with his wife, Hilary Sample of Columbia University, under the firm name Moss, is that it's all over, and it's everything all at once. But it results in quirky and refined simplicity in its answers. Highly technological, highly intellectualized, highly theorized, the work in the end is clean and buildable and smart in a way we don't see enough of in contemporary practice. The firm is far from conventional, pursuing architecture at all scales and methods, from developing software that deploys physics-based engines to form-find, to films that engage surrealism and time, to furniture that bridges from fabrication to scales of space, to installations that engage material and form to challenge perception, and to an ever-exciting and ever-growing list of built projects. In all these modes of practice, he spans between art and building elegantly, where I believe architecture really should lie. His work lands in quirky opportunities that he executes with passion and rigor, from a drive-in theater to Marfa, to a furry PS1, to a floating house in Canada, to a nomadic long-span factory structure in which they build pneumatics, to a beautiful project we were actually able to visit this summer in the USC Southwest Field Studies course at the base of Charles Ross's heroic star axis in the wilds of New Mexico. The work zigs when you think it will zag. It has thoughtful sculptural forms that are rooted in precedent and typology. It uses the newest materials and techniques, but with a calm clarity that make them thoughtful and cool in all regards. I think the approach to their work is difficult to actually understand. Even their website takes on a self-designed and self-reflective cataloging process that makes it beautiful to bathe your eyes in. On the firm, it is described, and I think worth reading, and this is a quote, We really don't know exactly when Moss started. Although we didn't have an office, it was sometime in 2003. When we began, our name was ! ##, which we quickly found was too difficult to use because one, you couldn't pronounce it, and two, you couldn't get a web address. So eventually we drifted towards Moss, an acronym of our names and a shared desire to be horizontal and fuzzy as opposed to tall and shiny. In 2006, we began our makeshift office around a large table and began working through a range of design experiments, a make-believe of architectural fantasies, problems, and thoughts about what we would be building if we could only get the work. As we've grown, we've continued to operate around one large table as a design office that works closely on each project through playful experimentation and serious research. I look forward to tonight's lecture entitled, "This is Not Working," as through his words and images, I'm certain Michael will crack the door into his wild world of disjunction and mess to show us some of his roots and some of his most recent undertaking, each seeded with intuition and originality, all cleverly focused. His belief that architecture is intrinsically cultural, with a value that is constantly being renegotiated, sets the stage for consistent questioning. Without a stable vision of what an architecture office is, their practice is a true workshop, focused on critical questions that expand the field to engage a diversity of disciplines, to reimagine the boundaries of practice as a whole, and produce work that is weird and unsettling, the ultimate compliment. And now some facts. Michael is a principal and founder of Moss Architects, as well as an assistant professor at Princeton University and director of graduate studies there. He received his Master of Architecture with distinction from Harvard GSD, and he previously taught at the University of Michigan, where he received the Muschenheim Fellowship, followed by a stint at Toronto, and then Harvard, and now again at Princeton. He's been a resident at the Atlantic Center for the Arts with Dave Hickey, the infamous art critic, as well as the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas. His writing has been widely published in Artforum, AD, Harvard Design Review, He was co-editor of the book Matter with myself, Matter, Material Processes in Architectural Production, and was editor of Log 22, as well as From Control to Design, Parametric Algorithmic Architecture, published by Actar. So, without any further ado, please give him a warm welcome.
How do you turn the lights off? Okay. Oh, yeah, I can see. Thanks, Gail. It's nice, and kind of overly nice introduction in a way. I don't know if it's merited. I would say it's Gail. Even the time at the GSD was very influential, and I'm going to try to start. Like Gail, you have to understand. Gail and I, like Gail's. I think there was a time when we were really hardcore about this. Like literally, there was no living space in your apartment. It was just models and mac and cheese and no bed. I think you slept on models. And I mean, it was crazy. And I had an army cot. And there was a time where it was like hardcore. It was like this hardcore kind of belief. I don't think. I think I've probably gotten a lot softer in my age. So what I was going to do is the way I'm going to sort of begin with the worst way to begin with an apology, and just about what I'm going to put you guys through. I've edited stuff down, but I wanted to present some of the early work, some of the work that's in formation, some of the really sort of cringe-making, embarrassing stuff in a certain sense. That happens always, usually when you're younger, but with the attempt to sort of look at it, it's sort of let's say, selfish to some degree too, to reflect upon the work and where it's come from, because it's sort of a rare opportunity to look, to reflect in a certain nowadays. So let me start. The other thing I want to note is that I will drift in and out of, this is slightly pretentious perhaps, but sort of drift in and out of first and third person a lot of times, like I or we. I would just want to say that everything that you'll see here, even the kind of that horrible personal artsy stuff at the beginning, really had Hilary's input, because we've known each other for so long, since we're 17 essentially. And the other thing to note is that a lot of the work is also done with an office. So there's a bunch of people behind it in the building projects especially. So, okay. This pretty much starts like right after graduation from the GSD. I had a fellowship to go to Marfa, Texas. And I kind of this is sort of your brain after a graduate school. Kind of struggling to some degree with what you're going to do. And so when in Marfa, I basically had set up a kind of staged factory and a kind of real factory of production, looking at the problems of, let's say, total design or total design. So, making weird, just doing everything. I can't even understand some of the stuff nowadays, like lining up 4 Kleenex. I mean, there's definitely a problem of thinking about, let's say, Donald Judd to some degree, but also the problems of thinking about geometry or meaning, or doing things like making a plastic fried egg, stacking up inflatables, working on a house, collecting weird material experiments, drip like plastics that were on foam, that were set up either as cushions or paintings or mattresses, depending on their orientation, making cushions for Donald Judd chairs. This is the cushions. I made a whole series of them. It made the chair a little bit more bearable, honestly. They make you writing theme songs for people. who were there in Marfa. I have a kind of sort of interest in music and a background doing some music composition. So like, I would ask them to basically specify what their theme song would sound like and start to produce it. I literally was going on, I tried to go on a diet, like that was a calorie counting. I had this whole sort of mathematical formula to try to literally become more minimal, sort of like really bad jokes like that were kind of important at the time. Things like this I can't even understand now. But like problems that are probably inherent, or in a way, problems of art historical thoughts, you know, about the problem of a figure, or the problem of let's say eradicating yourself, which is a long history in the avant-garde. This was like a house that was done for the director of the Chinati Foundation at the time, looking at a kind of connect the dots idea of a house, of a structure that was somewhat flexible, that was based off of, in a way, they were kind of early Voronoi-ish projects I see now, but like looking at literally how not to design, like struggling with the problems of geometry, you know, in a way, and thinking about trying to find some other way to operate. So this was like taking a grove of pecan trees and then mirroring it, and then using that literally as a structure and things like this, playing with those things. Writing these, I had a whole bunch of different like disclaimers I was working on. This is kind of one of the early ones, talking about the Farnsworth House, and it's different now, but when it was owned by, I think, Lord Palumbo or something, and going to visit it, it was just, the bathroom was a total surprise to me, because it was like literally every inch of that bathroom was filled with incredible works of art, like just stuffed around the toilet. So, and that kind of imagery had an effect, making in and out trays. We still use these in the office, but they kind of just have a practical use now. But there was some other thinking about it at the time. In 2001, and then this was work that was done in Marfa, and then going to Michigan, and then from there to Toronto, and being in Toronto really in the World Trade Center, and then right after this is the world I think we're in now still to some degree. Literally a week after the World Trade Center, there was a magazine, Surface magazine, I don't know if it's still around, that sent out sent an email to me saying, do you have any proposals for the World Trade Center, which I thought was a very strange thing to think about even at the time. And so I came up with a fictional character, Meredith Michaels, and she was a woman artist, and she submitted it, and then somehow it took off, and Terry Riley from MoMA at the time called looking for Meredith, and wanted to talk to her, and then there was an interview in a Japanese magazine with Meredith. And there was a photo. We had to submit a photo, and this was the photo at the time, I remember. We submitted it. Things like this. I mean, like, it is really hard to understand where this impulse for doing this comes from to some degree, but like looking at, questioning the data, let's say, driven, at the time when we were students, there was, I would say, a subset of thinking about architecture through data. I think it's still prevalent in a way, and it's still kind of useful, let's say, but it became, let's say, the disciplinary arguments were through, like, via maybe Cool House or something like this. And so these were kind of thought experiments on basically trying to quantify myself at a certain moment. So this was like 50% happy, 5% confused, 40% optimistic, or something. Like I would try to look at this idea of how to construct a kind of the limits of, let's say, quantification, coat racks, and making objects, and setting up a studio space where you just, in a way similar to Marfa, just kept a kind of discipline of making things. And then this is like a first project. I've never presented this project before, but it was like kind of one of these projects you get through friends of family members, etc., for a small house, lake house in upstate New York, and in a way, I think some of the work, the later work even still is somehow related to this. It was basically looking at a kind of straightforward, say, house type that is kind of everywhere around, and then distorting it according to the landscape, and inserting. There's basically a void that cuts through the center of the plan of the building here, which allows light and air down to allow for another bedroom basically in the basement. So there was, and you can see here. So this is the lower level. This was planted here, but it's also that's underneath the void space, and then up above, these are 2 bedrooms, the kitchen, kind of big open space garage here. While doing that, still doing things like got really fascinated with carpets, rugs, shag rugs. This was kind of horrible first draft of some carpets, like literally trying to become a machine in its making, in a certain sense, hand drilling this sheet of nylon to produce a shag carpet, and then eventually doing it all through, let's say, a milling machine. It was all automated. Looking at some of these, and then this was part of an exhibition in Toronto on a series of mat projects that I had done. The mats themselves, the one thing is that there's a kind of clear proportional geometric thing, but then trying to still find a way to undermine it through this other process of scripting, in a sense. This was all done through writing code. We were looking into things like how mold grows, how it will cluster and shoot out spores and cluster again, and we tried to recreate kind of the effects of mold. Those sort of early things, and then the next iteration of it, we're looking at objects exploded, so taking like tetrahedral objects, exploding them, and then subdividing and turning them into surfaces. This was, I think, one of the last exhibitions at Henry Urbach's gallery in New York. These were also made with, remember the time we were really obsessed, and I don't even know if it's true, I remember hearing that Mies had people mix graphite in with the paint to produce this kind of blackness. So we mixed graphite in with the rubber, and we're thinking about that and trying to produce this effect, which I always loved that idea, trying to make, let's say, a building look more like a drawing, literally. So trying to think about that space that's between, let's say, a representational space and a real space. So we were actively sort of searching, trying to look at that effect. The next project I'm going to show is I brought this up for Jeff, who's here, who teaches here, who was really heavily involved in this project, and this was a puppet theater for Pierre Huyghe at the Carpenter Center. One of the first things, when going to Harvard to teach as a young faculty member was sort of coming there and then jumping onto this crazy schedule to produce this puppet theater. And it's a small, basically, shell structure that is made out of polycarbonate plastic, and every piece was custom heat formed. It was like we were just sort of making it also up in a way as we went. It was kind of an amazing experiment at full scale, like a full scale model. Like I remember doing the mock-ups and everything failing, and then having to figure out how to fix it, and But thinking about the structure, and this is, I would say, this was looking at it, this was a kind of clear, showing also the interest of the time, a kind of having a geometric system, let's say, in this case, a very clearly parametric system of geometry, and then trying to figure out ways to undermine it almost through usually surface effects, or, so in this case it was with this moss on the outside of it, these kind of foam panels. The foam panels were like a whole process. I mean, the problem with showing this kind of breadth of work that I'm showing you guys now is there's not much depth to it, but every panel you can imagine is laid out. And then there's foam that goes in, and then the foam, we had to make these kind of horrible slurries of beer and they had like moss food. And we remember that? And we had to slather that on all these panels and stick them in there, and then somehow it would help to adhere the moss to it. And then one of the things I think that came out of this, though, for me, was this end piece. There was a moment, I think this really changed the thinking at the time in a very simple, modest way, was the way to deal with the end and to leave the droop and the failure, in a certain sense, the structural kind of droop. I remember even when Pierre was there, he's like, that isn't right, doesn't look right, we got to fix that or something. But like in fighting for it and thinking that droop was really important in a way, and it was the beginning of thinking another way through the problem of architecture, trying to look at another model or way of thinking, let's say. This is the interior. Forget the number of wing nuts we use, but it's ridiculous. And the panels on the top are kind of like keystones that fit into to allow for tolerance in a way for the system, because it is a system that is almost like too complete. After that, we were invited to, actually this is a little bit out of order. This was before the puppet theater. We were invited out of the blue to, I think this was after Meredith Michaels talked to Terry Riley. He decided that maybe to invite us to do something for PS1 when we were really way too young to do it. I mean, PS1 is we have had the kind of strange, I'm not going to show all of them, but the strange luxury of losing more than anybody for PS1. So we had done it 3 times. Losing it twice, and finally, like the third time, we were like, we're not going to do it. There's no way. And then we didn't have any work, so we were like, okay, we'll do it. But the first time, I remember showing up. We just had like a little pile of 11 by 17s to present, and everybody had these huge models, and like I forget, Servo was there, and they had like a DJ with them playing, and it was like I remember being so intimidated. But this was just looking at a large hammock, and I think these things of kind of this relationship of, let's say, geometric systems to other things, to weight or to materiality, or to try to understand and work through that a little bit. So this was a large hammock, basically, also thinking about like artwork and Legia Clark, sort of social experiments in the 60s. I have a great appreciation of Legia Clark's work, where she would do, and some of it's makes you so uncomfortable, some of these weird sort of erotic social experiments with people like blindfolded on hammocks, and it's kind of strange stuff, but the attempt to look for new social models almost that weren't based on visuality. I just thought that some of those projects that she did were just incredible. And this is just to give a sense of kind of, and again, like I was saying, the sort of embarrassment of a young, of youth, of trying to do so many things, maybe, and just sort of spreading out in so many directions. And then this was when asked to do a lecture at the GSD, I instead produced a movie And I would say it was influenced in a way. The response is also influenced by things like working with Pierre Huig and also, I mean, I always had an interest in say, film, which has a long history in architecture, well, the architectural avant-garde. So hiring basically an actor from LA, actually. These guys all flew out from LA to David Nordstrom and Dave Fenster. And they were just out of film school, and hiring them and basically giving them a script of all things I had written, and then having this guy argue with me about architecture, where I am sort of pathetic in a neck brace, and I don't say very much in the movie, and he constantly cuts me off, and with my own thoughts in a way. So while that was going on, just to give a sense of the confusing things that were happening, at the same time working with Simon Greenwald at MIT, who was worked with Casey Reese and Ben Fry on kind of physics engines for processing. And we were looking at things like soda play, some of these truss. You can see it's sort of similar to like World of Goo, I guess now, which you guys might know, where you have truss, like spring-based truss models, and trying to produce structural models from these very weak systems that are iterated, and then they would kind of grow around spheres or objects that are kind of hidden around there. So these are some of the things that came out of that. There are some other projects that are not shown in here. There was we got a project for a house on a lake, for a series of houses actually, that floats. It's kind of like one of those projects that I feel like I have to look at it too much, so I kind of took it out. And it helped in a way lead to some other projects like this. This was a studio in upstate New York for a painter. And basically, it's a pretty, in a way, it's like like what all painters really want is a loft space, it seems, and a kind of open space, and then but thinking about how to produce it without any shear walls. So this is a different model. So we did these kind of three-legged moment frames, which produced less depth and allowed for windows on the end, and then came up with a really kind of this, which we still use a lot now today, a very deep sort of double wall system around the edges, which was great for acoustics and sort of insulation, thermal bridging performances and stuff like that. But and the thing that we really wanted to focus on, I don't know if it was successful or not, but we tried many different things, is really thinking about the skin condition and how that the shingling would affect, let's say, the reading of this patterning in a way like some of the other things would affect the reading of the form. So we tried many different things. I think the hard part was that architecture, like from some of the installation things that we were doing, you can start to see some of the lines and things like this. It may be too subtle in the end, but it also becomes difficult to, let's say that I feel like architecture has a kind of different time span almost to think about. So some of these things, like the patterns, just became so almost. I started feeling really guilty that we were going to force this thing on somebody that was just going to end up being awful and kitsch in like a couple of years. But this gives a sense of what the interior is like. Basically, a grid of recessed lights, a kind of diagrid, and completely open space. We got lucky with really great builders. Like, don't really have a kind of close-up of this, but we have like these triangulated saw-cut joints, which are amazing that they could do them in the concrete. And then after that, this is a project that is going on still now, but started back in 2007 is a drive-in from Marfa, Texas, and it basically it's pretty simple. I mean, we looked at kind of engineering standards from the 50s, so it's a drive-in and band shell, looking at kind of new ideas of performance spaces. I mean, I always think heavily loaded, being in Marfa, a place I know well, it's kind of, I always think of it as the other side of the 60s, maybe, if the more of the Warhol exploding plastic inevitability, where it's the more of the psychedelic, let's say, the music and film kind of thing. But these are some mock-ups that we had done actually back in 2008, but of the screen, just to look at how it would get built. But it's a series of, I don't know if I have this is an older plan, but it's basically similar. There's a projection booth. There's now 3 buildings. So there's like a kind of restroom area and food area, a green room, a projection booth, and a screen. We just are going into shop drawings right now for the screen. This was a project for a painter, Philip Taft, who saw the other studio, or his gallerist did, and liked it, and so we went to. It's in Tyrol, Austria, and it was a project in which we started thinking about the problems of, let's say, I think in some of the other work, they're much more singular building types, sort of generic, stripped down, almost vernacular building types. Something almost, I would say, kind of undesigned. But thinking about the problem with this is a problem of, let's say, part-to-whole relationships, aggregation problems. So how do you think about a serial system? I mean, we originally had many more kind of things, but got stripped away with the budget. Like a serial system that then is also a singular figure. And then thinking about things like the roof. And there were some performance arguments because the snow, a huge amount of snow, Tyrol, and thinking about the snow as a potential insulator. And they do use this, like in their vernacular, the snow is really up against the sides of the building in the wintertime, and helps insulate the building. Hanging chain software, and looking at, in a way, a lot of Simon had also, who we were working with, had also worked with, like Axel, who I teach with at Princeton, and who had been doing these Gaudi experiments, and we were looking at them through the hanging chain, but then looking through surfaces and the problem of panelizing the surfaces, exploiting them, and trying to make models out of them. So these were some of the early experiments with that software, all in processing, and then also starting to get more to think about processing as a kind of aesthetic tool. So we started trying to work through a color palette, what we were calling rainbow vomit, which was a kind of misuse of a scientific palette, the full spectrum, which was kind of it was for us also like using white to some degree. And then we actually had, this was part of a project that also came about through someone in the real estate development, Rick Pizer. I remember at Harvard, and to do a temporary pavilion in Covent Garden. And we were producing these things, and there was no way we were going to get it, unfortunately. But we started using the study models and the models to start to film, to start to think about the work in another way, a way to reflect on the work. So we used them to, like, this was a movie we made about zombie architects who time travel through that project into the future, trying to look for sort of utopia, let's say, kind of cosmopolitan, sustainable utopia, but the technology breaks down, and they arrive off course in at night, and there's these little scale figures basically arguing with each other about what they're going to find when the sun comes up. Another carpet. This was looking at, I think this was like, we start off with like Bruno Taut, glass pavilion, and exploding it into like this bearskin rug. This was for an exhibition that actually Marcello Spina and Georgina put together called Matters of Sensation. And in this case, we were pushing as far as we could, like let's say the fur, as far as we could with the tools that we had available. And this was very much based, this was even more, like we had refined the scripts and really gotten it, I think, much closer to how mold and spores work in this case. Software, other rigid body experiments, we used processing a lot. I mean, basically, our approach to the software stuff was always to find models that were, I would say, trying to think about it through a kind of video games physics, like not like there's some other space. So let's say if at some point I think when we were students, there was a clear debate in the field where you were either, like, you would be on the representational side of the field of architecture, so you would be interested in geometry, plans. It would be more conceptual, let's say, and then there was another side that was interested in making things, materials, tectonics. Let's say the real, and those were real divides. Like that was a real like battle, I would say, as students in the field. And so you could never like Peter Eisman and Billy Chen and Todd Williams or something back then. If it would be an impossibility. And for us, we were trying to find some other space, I think, with the software, trying to think of a space that is neither real nor representational. And I think the video game physics gave us a sort of this space to play with, like literally play with in some cases. I mean, these are like really these are like, I have kids now, and this is what, I mean, I basically spend half my day doing this with blocks, and they come over and knock them over. And there's a sort of pleasure in it. In a really simple way. You spend like 3 months making software, then basically you structure the software so it can produce harmonic equilibrium and kind of grow and always grow, so it's like right on the verge of collapsing, and then you can delete a block or add a little sideways gravity or something and watch it fall over, or even put in the parameters of it so it's on the it is pushed to the point where it won't be stable. And then we were working on the software, and then we started, I think through a Bucky Fowler symposium at a school, we met this guy, Tobias Putri, who's an artist, and we started doing a series of projects with him, which were were really great, and it kind of important for us to think about the work and to have that dialogue with an artist and somebody who is really knowledgeable and interested in architecture as well. These are some of the other pieces, sort of piles of blocks, foam blocks. This is in the Boymans Museum. And then the third time for PS1, like I was saying, I left out the second time, but the third time we almost did not do it. And again, thinking about, let's say, these are basically hyperbolic surfaces, paraboloids, and then thinking about a kind of geometric system that then gets, let's say, undermined by its material effects in certain ways. So this was a kind of some of the early drawings we did, thinking about, this was, I think, using ecotact and looking at shade and kind of cooling through kind of how much shade we could get in a way. And this gets the least amount of light and was naturally already when we did our analysis, the kind of coolest spot with a lot of thermal mass. So we put a lot of the stack effect chimneys in this area, and then working on a system of kind of oculi pieces that kind of work their way through the site. These are some of the kinds of drawings we were doing. So we were looking at a kind of kit of, I mean, the budgets on these things are horrible. I mean, they run off of interns, you know. So we were looking at a system where a kind of standard set of scaffold parts that we could use, standardized piping, and then fabricating only specific things like the oculus, the side, just even this part of the side bend, and then we would cut everything else on site with chop saws. So just looking at the curved parts, getting those made, and then the rest is standardized pipe that we can use, and then also the footings. For me, the footings were the kind of the major invention of the project, but they're the part that nobody ever sees. It's like it was basically a sandwich of steel with pipes between it, backfilled, that had to take all of the structural resistance of the wind loading on the surface, which is quite a bit, and they had to be super precise to make sure that everything could meet up, because it is a kind of zero tolerance system. Wrapping it in aluminum kind of netting. It's kind of like an inverted Hershey's Kiss or something. It was like this kind of aluminum netting with this kind of thin thatch on the outside. When I remember when MoMA showed up, when we were just about done, Glenn Lowry was upset. He really was like insistent we had to give it a haircut. He's like, gotta cut the bangs off. It was like hilarious. And then looking at things like, even now looking back at things that seemed pretty expedient at the time, how they can influence you or somehow are in the thinking. Like we did all these rectangular block seats that we would pile up and let them just drift or do whatever they wanted, in a certain sense, in the space, as a kind of trying to think about, let's say, another model of organization even within this. All of the thatch, I should say it's something a little bit more. Gail was telling me, I tend not to go into a lot of depth on these things, like I said, because it's a kind of rabbit warren. And but each of the most, let's say, parametric part of this project is the thatch to some degree. I mean, this is a series of all unique panels, and yet they were made in Indonesia and then shipped over by hand. So this is like what they use for an underlayment for a typical roof for a thatched roof. It's not the finished thing. So we had to get it all done, like everything precisely laid out into a kind of set of diagrams and measurements, sent to Indonesia, get them made and shipped through shipping containers and arrive within a matter of, and go through customs, which, you know, is kind of, was its own hassle, and then arrive in time for the deadline with enough time to put it all together. This is what, and then this is probably the view that everyone started calling it Snuffleupagus, I think. All the people in the neighborhood. There were some people in the neighborhood that came by and started, kind of, I don't know what it was. It came out when that horrible movie like Year One was out, or some cavemen were really big, and there was like a whole bunch of people dressed up like cavemen for a while and started doing performance acts and sending us the videos. And I remember thinking like, oh my God. At first I was like horrified by it, but then realizing that actually it was pretty great. And then after we were done, we started also trying to think about the films in a different way. So actually trying to film, like, people who worked on the project, basically, and people in our office were willing and interested to sort of dress up in Tyvek suits, like scale figures, essentially, and like little model figures, and sort of look at different film different views, and then create a story which was about a kind of false archaeology on the work, in the manner of things like In Search Of. I don't know if you know those kind of weird 70s. Leonard Nimoy used to narrate it, of kind of these kind of mysteries of the world, and it was a story for us. Like when we write these things, they're really, I mean, I don't think they're coded with a sort of set of inside jokes even, or references about the field or the discipline or thinking about architecture, and this was really a thought about the avant-garde in a certain sense, and also thinking about technology and sustainability. In most cases, I mean, we have like this one, like the zombies in a certain sense, there's a kind of narrative of technology that malfunctions, which eventually, so this one, there was a kind of cooling system that kind of breaks down, or their kind of, biosphere system doesn't work anymore, and then they have to escape. That's what the film is called, Escape. Going back to another scale, even afterwards, is thinking about benches and sort of circles that were then, like, would hit, like cells, I guess, fold, produce sort of structural aggregations. These were done early, and then we repeated this kind of technique again for Venice and some other projects that we have worked on for looking at furniture. Moss. This was we used the sand project. We were, like, the software stuff goes on in the background. It sort of has its own momentum. And this was a series of, like, looking at a kind of aggregation of parts within containers that you would put holes in, or objects, and let them, treating it like sand. I mean, it's limited. The thing that was nice, and I think it is nice about processing, is it has a kind of limited computational capacity, so it forced us to kind of, there are limits to the number of pieces that we could have, for instance, before our computers would crash. So we would try to push it as far as we could, but that limit, I think, and constraint was incredibly useful for us to think about it, and produced other effects. Like, I think at the time we were really interested in not smart geometry. Like, the thing which was at this point, and even in some of the earlier work, the interest in the parametrics, or kind of geometric systems was really trying to be undermined even further, to some degree, through physics engines, and thinking about really dumb geometries like cubes, let's say, or something like this. Not a smart, kind of crystalline, localized symmetries, etc., but just like piles of cubes. and then making them. So this was for Vice magazine, part of their Creators Project. This was for a performance that went around the world for certain bands. This one, I think Sleigh Bells. I mean, I was there. Sleigh Bells played in front of it or something. And one of the problems with this was just how to, I think, trying to look at it like right before it, like not having it come to a kind of stable state necessarily in the software, but stopping it right before it settles. So it's not, you can see the relationship to the ground is not flat or even. All the cubes were coated in glitter also, which helped with some surface friction things of how they would, because they're all actually just clumps that are kind of nested into each other. And then in, what year is this now? Yeah, 2009, we were approached to do a small house for the Museum of Outdoor Arts, a kind of guest house for Charles Ross in the Las Vegas, New Mexico, or near Las Vegas, New Mexico. And it was it's like all of our projects. The one thing you're not used to when you're younger is just how long architecture takes. I mean, it's years and years. So we were doing basically two competing proposals for them. One was a really long building, and the other one was what we ended up with. And then producing films and then showing them. I mean, in a way, this was a lot of times the films had just been for us, or for an exhibition, or just for architects maybe in some ways, but this is when we started to show the clients the films and stuff like this as part of it, which I'm surprised they didn't just run away. They, like looking at, basically this one is called Romance of Systems, sort of this long, this first scheme, a kind of a story about two architects, Frank and Alice, who kind of, one is a kind of, artistic formalist, and the other is kind of functional. It's basically about the art and life split, and reading a lot of Rancière at the time and thinking about this problem of autonomy and heteronomy. So that kind of was getting played out through the films for us while thinking about architecture. This is the project in Las Vegas, New Mexico. I was just there 4 days ago or something. It's almost done, but it's taking forever. And basically, this is a project that began with looking at some of these late Wright houses, these kind of weird hex triangular houses, and kind of scaling them up almost to a kind of there's these late Wright houses that are really great, and then you can see these early Kahn houses, which I think are like fragments, like the Shapiro house by Kahn and Anting, kind of fragments of almost Wright houses, late Wright houses, and thinking about those plans in a way, but trying to think about the plan and let's say the section or elevation almost as two different projects. So looking at these kinds of systems of kind of, let's say, these kind of radiating plans that kind of patterns and systems, and then the elevation as a kind of problem of a kind of generic vernacular house type. And then building all kind of out of real, full-scale foam core in a sense, but these SIPS panels, which were made in Rhode Island and near us at the time, and then shipped down to the site. But these, basically like a passive house. And thinking about, and then you can see it coming together here. Just like a kind of kit of parts. We did all the shop drawings for it. I mean, in a way that when you start off doing these smaller projects, you're used to having to do everything. I mean, some of it is crazy for liability purposes, but we have tended to do almost all of our shop drawings in every project. We've never, I think the screen in Marfa is going to be the first time we're really reviewing shop drawings and not producing them, although I feel like in the end we will probably end up producing them. So a kind of series of all unique pieces. You can see them. There are some repetition, but they're all numbered, kind of like a large puzzle. It's put together. These are just some photos I took, like I said, a few days ago. So the things that have happened, and it's still not done. There's things that down here that aren't done, but some of the changes even in the thinking are kind of, that's one of the problems with projects that take a long time to produce is, like for instance, the entry into this was at one point was at the beginning a parallelogram and then was changed like a year ago to like just dumping gravel and sand in front of it on two sides into these piles. And the other thing that we were trying to think about was, as well as the roof, I mean, we tend to think we're really obsessed with chimneys, and we're still obsessed with chimneys. As part of it is thinking about them as a kind of different performance, like the chimney. But the chimney is, you know, even at the time when we were doing the early things with the client, we were tracking the chimney and looking at Semper through Wright, through Venturi and Kahn and Venturi, and looking at architects who, I mean, there's architects who really deal with the chimney as a problem, and then there's those who don't. Even if you look at Korb, how Korb will deal with a chimney and thinking about it as a column in a certain sense, in like some of his work, or even Hayduck does that too, and then there are some who just can't deal with a chimney, like Eisman never has a chimney in his projects, or even Scott. I was teasing Scott. He's never, all his house projects avoid chimneys. So the problem of thinking about the chimney not as a kind of, no longer a kind of the hearth or the center. I mean, it's kind of, chimneys are weird things in a way, aren't they? I mean, they're like this dirty, solid, inaccessible thing that is at the center of the house, and they provide, you know, a place to cook and heat the house in a way and they occupy, in most cases, even in like some of either the let's say the dead center, or the two, if you look at traditional houses, they kind of bookends or something, or the periphery, but they become the kind of important kind of reference points, and looking at now the chimney as a kind of loss, because the chimneys are just products now. I mean, our kind of relationship to these things is much different. They don't require the same labor they once did. They don't work structurally like they once did. They are just products you plug into a kind of 2x4 framing system. This is the interior, and so the chimney now becomes a series of distributed voids that are solar chimneys. Some work, because this was a prototypical house, we had a sort of general sense of south, but it kind of got changed a little, it got rearranged on site according to the kind of thing. So some of them are, I think most of them are kind of are facing south, and then there's others that are more used for more indirect lighting. This one is like my favorite space of the house. It's like this large double solar chimney. It's this huge space up in there that's totally inaccessible. And it has this crazy presence when you're in the place. This is a project that's currently under construction for an orphanage in Kathmandu. It's basically, again, looking at a kind of vernacular in the area. We looked at like the typical like the way things are built in Kathmandu is it's a concrete frame structure, which is about a 30 centimeter, it's a standardized formwork that all the concrete frames are made of. Then they have brick infill to stabilize the frames. And we were looking at a way to use that kind of standardized formwork, but get rid of the brick infill because this is for a nonprofit group. It's incredibly low budget, really, for the size of it. And then the other thing is, with that, looking at how to produce a kind of a structural framework that can become to perform at a high level. So it's like this doubling up of the exoskeleton to deal with seismic, because seismic is the biggest concern in the region. So the stairs and the stairs actually work to help brace it. They're also concrete to brace the between the two frames, and then the frames themselves basically become the public space for circulation, etc. And the interior is basically really, let's say, simple. So the ground floor is a library, which is used for a public library. There's two different NGOs involved in the project. One is for an orphanage, and the other is for a public library. And the meeting space for the community, bathrooms. This is for staff. I mean, the thing is, like, in all of our projects, for some reason, and it's a strange thing because I probably, if you asked us at the beginning of our careers, we would never imagine this, but we've had to become sort of experts in sustainability. So this is like these are methane biodigesters. So everything operates off of kind of vegetable waste, which is pretty common already in Nepal, to produce gas that they then can cook with. The whole skin on the outside is a vertical permaculture system. We have a permaculture expert, so it's a lot of papaya and other things that basically, this is all planters that then can be used to grow and harvest food, literally, for the orphanage. This is the dormitory level. It's about 50 orphans total. This is a kind of earlier model. The site changed actually before construction started, where it was a little bit more like, had this kind of Breuer-esque bridge, but the slope changed because the site became too much water. We were worried about soil liquefaction and seismic, so it actually changed after we had done this. But looking at basically the system of sort of this shading brise-soleil system that's also a kind of vegetation system, and also a way to collect the roof, collecting rainwater on the roof and bringing it down. The cisterns are underneath here now. We got rid of this. There were a series of louvers on the outside that we don't really need, but this is it under construction. It's actually, these are kind of old. It's up to here now, but it's it's going to be a slow process, maybe by next August. These are other software projects that become just thoughts, like looking at that we're just looking at kind of systems of aggregation. That we were asked to do a master plan in China at one point, and we were trying to propose something like this, which we eventually stopped and just decided not to continue on anymore because it just wasn't working. But we started developing software, like looking at basically sort of like air hockey or magnets or something, where all the pieces would start to slide and move towards different magnets or different sort of attractors. Thinking about the kind of cruciform modernist housing type in a way as a kind of thing. And then I think this helped inform us think about, we were asked to partake in Museum of Modern Art's foreclosed exhibition with the oranges in New Jersey, and looking at working with Ed Glazer, who's a kind of economist, and looking at the cost of infrastructure, really taking a hard fact, like looking at the facts and the data to begin with, to some degree, to think about the cost of infrastructure and looking at it in relation to New York and things like this, and coming up with a proposal that was maybe, I mean, I think more didactic than anything, but looking at the costs of streets and thinking about if we could use those streets as actually social spaces for development, because everything else was very contested by multiple owners. You couldn't, and there might be an argument for this already, I mean, you couldn't really think big about urban development or social housing anymore. So we wanted to think about these two models and find some other space between it. One is like the row house type or the Jane Jacobs model, and then the kind of early Ed Logue urban planning of like Rudolph, like those brutalist textured concrete mega projects. I don't know why it's yellow here, but it's different on my screen. And then looking at a kind of like trying to get rid of the car basically in around the transit area. So the center of this is a train station, and then we basically take like 5 and 10 minute walking radius, sort of looking at kind of even let's say new urbanist principles of kind of pedestrian cities, and then but rethinking the street, which seemed like if we could get rid of the car, we don't need the street. Maybe in the same way, we could start to think about a much narrower set of access alleys or walkways along either side, sort of akin to maybe Venice or something like this. These are some of the these are basically the same sort of software experiments. Just we would set these up with kind of feeders, and they would sort of produce these log jams of buildings. I think it was great when occasionally a few of them would pop out of the barriers. So the kind of, there was a sense for, in a way, like the houses, they're really kind of generic almost types that are, there isn't a lot of even plan in them. They're kind of evacuated to some degree. Like these are linked together in a way that allows for different, let me see if I have a plan. The roof is a kind of new public space, let's say. Where these can start to create different figures within them. So you could have units that are like this, or small units. You could break it up or subdivide these things according to different economic models. And they became narrow enough. The one problem with, like, let's say townhouses and thinking about them is that the windows are kind of on the wrong, they're on the short faces, so I mean, it works great when you don't have great windows at the time and you want to, for performance and retaining heat, but now that, let's say, we're gotten better at our kind of window assemblies, the windows can go along the sides of them and start to bring in better daylighting. These are kind of early models, and we were looking at things like aerated concrete, which isn't really used that much in the US yet, but very popular in like Sweden and other things. But looking at a kind of aerated, very kind of an aerated, a precast aerated concrete. And we were, and the proposal was also not to delete or destroy the existing buildings, but leave them there and let them. There is a kind of ambivalence to somehow what happens to that space, but there is a kind of option where, let's say that the private space becomes public in the future potentially, or they just coexist. This new, let's say, public housing and private housing. I'm going to end on one last project, which is a school in Denmark. It's in Krabbesholm. Kind of an amazing client and project. There's basically this school. They've asked us to come and look at their studio spaces for art and architecture and photography and graphic design. They were kind of broken up. This isn't the full map of the school. There's like a Bow Wow project for a gallery down here. This is a Jorge Pardo house. Here is this is the original kind of 12th century farmhouse or manor house or something. There's like a kind of Bauhaus, modern factory style. This is where the graphic design, I think, is. Now there is a kind of dormitory here. These are old stable buildings. There's a kitchen, eating area. Architecture is here, and photography is over there, etc. And part of the proposal was to try to condense everything together and then put them, in close relationship to each other to allow for a series of spaces to form around them. So these, you can see from some of the models. We were looking. There's a series of buildings that are basically a kind of stable type that kind of exist as a kind of vernacular on the site. And we were looking at those in a way, and then kind of playing with some of the software things as a sort of sensibility to some degree of these log jams, or thinking about these things that are not organized necessarily through a kind of geometry, but through proximity or other things. And there was the sense of trying to make them as thin as possible, so there was a kind of transparency through them. It's a cement panel system, steel, really incredibly, it's because it's the law in Denmark, these crazy thick insulated walls that were almost like 18 inches deep. This is this super cute little building nearby with a little smiley face on it. This is one of the dorms. It is like utopia. It's crazy. When you go there, you think, oh my God, like they all eat together, and it's specific to the Danish school system, which is folk art schools, they call them, which are like basically between college and high school, and they try out different ideas or majors of what they want to do, and then they can build a portfolio and apply to school, etc., to continue their degree. But they all live together, and they all, like I was saying, they cook together, and the food is fantastic, and they're all just making stuff and experimenting. Like they're, we'll start playing music in one of these things and have a fashion show over here, and there's a crazy amount of energy from being young. I kept thinking, like, they're just, and everything is just done for a kind of strange pleasure. This is the Jorge Pardo's house there. This is all kind of grown in and kind of wild now, kind of taller grasses. You can start to see, like, kind of all the students basically can can basically all see each other. And then the idea is that, which I was surprised they even sort of did, it was, we wanted them to put a lot of chairs out in these, the porches, so people could hang out, like little chairs and tables and things like this, so that they could really mix. I mean, they always are looking for a place to, for some reason smoking seems like it's really popular there, for a place to smoke, and even when we were visiting before, but the studios always a place to sort of escape the studio and talk about studio, etc. at the same time. I'm just going to end with a small conclusion, I guess. I would just want to, we're in a moment where there are seemingly endless proliferation of camps and genres, and while architecture seems like kind of omnipresent nowadays through Tumblrs or websites like ArcDaily, etc., it remains mute. It seems kind of meaningless in some degree. There are kind of I mean, there seems to be no kind of major arguments that kind of are feeding the field or dilemmas. It's all good. Everyone coexists happily in their own little group. And I would say when we were students, I think even when Gail and I were students at school, there was a sense that you had to pick a term or a kind of medium specificity, you know, you had to identify yourself within the field, especially if you wanted to deal with academics. Even, let's say, you had to be the geometry person or the material person or the digital person or the cosmopolitan person or the program or tectonic, sustainability, parametric, whatever, cartoons, whatever theory, you had to pick a kind of, I would say medium condition, but also a kind of very specific kind of disciplinary orientation. And these obviously, as a student, in a kind of produce incredible anxieties, like which team are you going to pick, you know? And I would say we've tried, given that kind of condition that I feel like we've come out of, and there was a kind of escape from all that too, to some degree, through practice, like the escape from let's say all the neuroses, self-conscious neuroses of the academy, to get into practice and start making things. And I think it was a real shift that everybody in, let's say, our generation, our wave of students really got licensed right away. Even most of our teachers weren't licensed architects. So and so I would say while we are working with sort of a kind of architectural disciplinary projects, kind of legacies of avant-garde practices, like I think is very, for us as part of the work, it may not even be obvious, but like sort of the problems of, like, let's say, anti-architecture, which is kind of the driving narrative of the avant-garde to some degree, how to avoid authorship, how to produce a kind of, let's say, even a kind of generic space or minimalism, or stripping things to typology, or systemic processes that are not willful, seriality, repetition, ready-mades. The vernacular was another way to escape, in a certain sense, at one point. The architectural author, film, art, humor, you know, there's a list here. Chance processes, gravity, physics engines, performance, etc. They all become ways, in a way, they're kind of a way to collect all these. I think it was a very kind of negative and nihilistic model for both in art and in architecture, of non-composition, anti-things, striving for meaninglessness, etc. in those things as a kind of, but instead I think we are trying to figure out ways to work through that through aggregating them or collecting them or bringing them together, not trying to repeat that kind of nihilistic model in a certain sense of a kind of avant-garde. I think we're interested in models that are of architecture that are closer to music. I talk about this a lot. I think I'm really convinced music is our most advanced aesthetic project. We were just talking about this I was talking about this with Wes here. I think, through music, all of us, especially when you're younger, you kind of have deep attachments for short periods of time towards composers or bands or songs or whatever and that experience, that aesthetic experience is totalizing. It's political. Through its aesthetics, I was just reading Jonathan Letham's Fear of Music, which is really about this in a way, and it's about the Talking Heads album that when he was younger, listening to it and how he could think about the entire world through that album and thinking about music itself. So if someone says to you, "I'm a huge Fish fanatic," you would have a kind of sense of politics even, or diet even, or fashion choice, or whatever. They construct a kind of ontological project. You can, and those within that like sort of ontology, let's say, can argue with ridiculous intensity about which Fish album is the best, or which song is the most difficult or interesting, or what they should do next, or whatever it is, that you share enough sensibilities or kind of knowledge even that allows you to discuss and argue specifics, that these sort of aesthetic attachments that we have produce us. They produce a kind of identity. They contribute to value systems, meaning, etc. And aesthetics, especially via architecture, is ontological. They produce and structure reality. So, the most prosaic example of this is like when you're a teenager and you're trying to search for a kind of music that produces a space for yourself that not necessarily your parents would like. I remember specifically playing things in the car, and then my parents would be like, "Turn that off, this is awful," and kind of thinking, they just don't get it. Basically, this is brilliant stuff, and being able to share that with a kind of group to kind of structure a different reality. It also produces generational, let's say, narratives. I think we can think of plenty of examples in architecture like this, and one would be, I don't really want to kind of beat up on the parametric too much, because there are parts of it I like, but the parametric kind of offers this. You can look through kind of the entire world through that lens, which many people have. In a way, you can debate which Voronoi are good or bad, which feel cliche, But in general, I would say that like parametric sounds like techno music is what I usually say a lot. It's just like in techno music for me, although there are some aspects of it I like, it's pretty cheesy at times. It's an aesthetic project that is kind of slick and smooth, and the techniques of making it are even similar to, let's say, grasshopper sliders, etc. Like if you use it, but and at times, I know late at night I'll look through like Sucker Punch or things like this, and there's parts of it where it is really seductive at times, but it's something that doesn't. It still feels kind of literally expressionist to me, painterly splines, deforming surfaces and patterns. It has that kind of hubris of unmediated artistry that it seems like it's trying to undermine. At least it says it is. At least Schumacher says it is. And for whatever reason, I just don't. I can't identify with it wholly. We are constantly searching for something different. That's it. Thanks.